with figuring out that we shared the same values and how we treated our clients and our staff. That was the perfect combination. And I think it's important to note that we failed a few times first. I think it's really important to note that it was okay to not get there the first time and to keep going until you find that good match. One of the things that I say at the very beginning of these discussions with other organizations, which by the way I've continued, so we've completed one merger, that doesn't mean we should be done. There's still a lot more consolidation in the nonprofit field that can happen in Sonoma County and in the North Bay region. I would love to lead myself out of a job. If that's what has to happen, I walk into the room saying I'm willing to lead myself out of this job. And I have to mean it. I have to, whatever little fear that triggers, oh, what if I don't find another one? All of that has to just be put aside because it's my job to serve the mission and not to serve myself in my own job, in my own employment status. So I wanted to talk about using a consultant because I think there's a point at which we should have brought one in and we didn't. And now being in a different conversation that Bob is actually facilitating with my organization and another partner, watching the value of having Bob in the room and kind of wishing I'd had it before. But without actually a lot of regrets, the other executive director and I proposed to our boards that we could co-facilitate our entire negotiation process. And we did it. But it wasn't necessarily easy. It had some bumps along the way. But we literally split down the middle every responsibility, every meeting, every other agenda point. We alternated back and forth who was leading which part of which discussion. And it worked really well. By the time all was said and done, it took about a year. We had signed confidentiality agreements so that the conversation didn't leave the room until we were prepared for it to leave the room. The only exception to that, and this turned out to be very informative, was we told our local elected officials about it. We told our funding agencies, the primary funders that would be impacted. And we told our donors, our private donors, about it. And I was ready for concerns to be expressed. Oh no, what's going to happen to this? And nobody said that. What they said was good for you. And particularly the major donor, the large philanthropists in the community said, I wish everybody that I gave money to was having that dialogue. What an important thing to be doing. And that helped bolster both the board and the staff that were going through this kind of uncomfortable, significantly sometimes uncomfortable process. It really helped remind us that we were doing the right thing. So Bob has on the table here, that I don't know if he'll talk about later, but he has two workbooks. Nonprofit Mergers Workbook Part 1, which is the one I didn't read soon enough. And then the Mergers Workbook Part 2, which is Unifying After the Merge, which is the phase we're in now and that I'm actively using now that I'm aware of the resources. So there's some things that we did along the way. How much time do I have left? I'm having too much fun talking. Okay. So there's some exercises that aren't exactly what are in the workbooks. I would actually use his versions of it if I had the choice. But there's some things we did that really helped provide some clarity. They were interesting exercises to go through as a collaborative team. So we did the normal fiscal due diligence. You look at everybody's financials 3 to 5 years back, and is everybody stable and happy and healthy and all that good stuff. Then we actually sat down and created a hypothetical organizational chart. So we had the program staff and executive directors sit down and say, let's just, we literally had Post-it notes and a big blank white wall. Let's redesign our organization as if we were together and see if it plays out. Because financially, we didn't know yet, and programmatically, we didn't know yet. So let's actually do that programmatic piece. We sat down and did the normal stuff like our pay scales, benefits, time off, all of, how disparate are we, who's going to get hurt in the process. And then we did something that our CFOs both resisted, but turned out to be incredibly valuable, which is we created a hypothetical, as if we were going to agree to do this, merged organizational budget for 11-12, and said if we were to take everything you have and everything we have and bring it all together, does this actually pencil out as being a benefit? Because sometimes it sounds much better in theory than it turns out to be when it actually comes out on paper. So it turned out that there was real versus just theoretical cost savings, and that's actually proving out now that we're really, really doing it. So I think one of the things I said to my board, I think naively, when I very first started my job in 2008, I said, you know, all nonprofits should be merging. Why is this so hard? Why isn't everybody doing this? There's too many of us, there's too few back office resources. Nobody wants to pay to administer a nonprofit. They only want to pay you to give away the food. They don't care how you got it there, or the office that was required to have a phone present for the staff member to, you know, they don't care about that part. They just want to give away the food. So how do we do that better? And I thought, oh, this should be easy, quite naively. And I think what all of this process taught me was no matter how good of a business decision it is to merge, all of these other pieces matter so much. They matter so much that they're worth the time, they're worth the consideration, but at the end of the day, I'm very proud of the staff that have come together and the work they're doing, and we have increased services in our community because of the merge. And that's, at the end of the day, the story that I want to tell, and it's one that I will continue to pursue as a leader, no matter how challenging that process was. So I'm glad I got to tell you the story today. It was actually quite cathartic to sit down and write out the story so that I was prepared to speak today. So I look forward to hearing and answering any questions, and I'll be quite honest in my answers. So look forward to it.
And I understand we're the first audience you told that story to, so we're happy to hear that.
It was a lot of fun.
Good. So in case you all are not panicked or are starting to panic, we're not going to talk about mergers all day long. We're going to pull back from that a little bit because I think we talk about partnering and collaboration a lot, not very specifically. But I wonder if it's really the subject that we need to be talking about, Robert. Is that what we need to address? Or are we really talking about what tools there are for achieving a real successful end? And talk to us about what you see from your vantage point, which is very different from the other two speakers.
Thank you. I'd be happy to. First of all, I want to say, Katrina, how impressed I am with what you did, how smart it was, and how impressive your work was. I could not imagine it being done better than you described. So what I want to talk about is a little different from what I had prepared to say. So I'm going to make up a certain amount of this as I go along. So I want to start with the comment that Katrina made and that Celia just made. There's been a lot of discussion for a very long time along the lines of there are too many of you, you overlap, you duplicate, you all ought to be merging, you all ought to be doing, you need to eliminate. And when I worked as a program director of a local nonprofit, I did that, and I was working with a program that housed homeless people. And I knew for dead sure that there were way more people who needed housing than there was housing available or services available in the county. And that there was a fundamental life need for the services that were being provided out here. And I kind of resented the assumption that was being made by a lot of people that we were really unnecessary and duplicative. So that is part of the emotion that I carried with me into my job when I came to the Community Foundation. And I think probably on some level I swore that as a funder, it would take very extraordinary circumstances for me or for the Community Foundation to look at you and say, this is what you must do. I would much rather that as a funder we find a way to partner with you, to help to build your capacity, to do some education, to do, as Katrina talked about, some very thoughtful, very honest talking about what's going on in your organization, what's going on with your colleague organizations, and is there a way that the Community Foundation can play a role to help you resolve some of those long-standing issues, do a better job, serve the population that you're serving in a way that makes sense to you, and that you know is effective and that you can demonstrate is effective. So I think those are just a brief overview of the values that and because I am, for most of my 14 years at the foundation, the only program officer there, the values that the foundation brings to these kinds of conversations. That said, There is nothing wrong with partnering, there is nothing wrong with collaborating, there is nothing wrong with merging. And particularly when you think in terms of back office services, I think there is a very powerful argument there that there are too many organizations that need too many board members who are struggling to find good people to fill their boards. And so some way of merging and reducing the number of boards that need to be served and other back office services, I think is a perfectly legitimate concern and goal for us to be working toward.
Robert, I have to ask, would you fund those activities if two organizations came to you and said, we're interested in exploring this, but it takes capital to do it?
We would love to be able to do that. And for a while, we had a very small grant program, capacity building grant program of about $5,000. I would love a designed program for much larger capacity, self-assessment, capacity building work that in some cases would lead to a decision for some more structured form of working with another organization. Unfortunately, we haven't, for this conversation, we have put that money into supporting direct service programs. But if I could ever find another $50,000 or $100,000 a year to do it, I would do it in an instance. I think building capacity and providing the resources that you need to answer your questions and solve your issues is a fundamental responsibility of the Community Foundation. I can give one example where of an occasion where I really did go to two organizations and say, you know, you really need to think about doing this together. It was a competitive grant program in the environment, and two organizations unknown to each other submitted proposals for working with local neighborhood groups to monitor water quality in local streams. And to read the proposals, they were almost completely identical. So when I got them, I was interested in this, and I went to each of the organizations individually and said, you know, I have another proposal that looks just like yours, but your name isn't on it. And I would like for you to read that person's proposal if you will give me permission to give that person your proposal to read. And we both said fine, and we did that. And then the Community Foundation said, well, these are both good programs, and they're both an important thing to do. We will fund you if you come up with a combined program. If that work, you know, you have to tell me first, will that work for you? If it will, we will fund you if you come up with a combined program. And they did, and we did. And that really worked pretty well. In the same competitive grant process that those two applications came in with, I was doing a site visit with another organization, and the main ecologist of the organization was talking about how, in a sense, lonely the work of environmental organizations is because they don't know what one another is doing. And it's very, very hard to find out what one another is doing. And so that stuck in my mind for some time. And so I took that person and the two people who had collaborated together, and I brought them together and discussed, is there a way that we can, if we were interested in convening the environmental organizations in the county to find out what one another is doing, do you think that people would want to come to that? And do you think that they would think that that was an important use of their time? And I said, yeah. So we widened that group to about a half a dozen people, and we started convening it over time, and we widened it probably to 6 or 10 organizations. And to make a long story short, they were very good, very exciting discussions for the first 4 or 5 months, but at some point they said, we really need a purpose to be here. We need a goal we want to achieve together. And so they worked on that for a little bit, and they came up with The very simple, easy-to-do idea of let's come up with a plan to preserve Sonoma County's biodiversity. We have no money to spend to do that, and probably a couple $100,000 worth of time and effort to at least begin that process. So we set out to do it on the assumption that we could probably do 80% of it for 20% of the cost of doing 100% of it. And 4 years later, working very slowly, $1 at a time, we came up with a draft plan called a Biodiversity Action Plan for Sonoma County. That is about 70 pages of science, fact, and investigation, laying out a series of prioritized issues of the threats to Sonoma County's biodiversity. This is a particularly important thing for those of you who don't know. Sonoma County is one of the most biologically diverse places on the whole earth. It is one of probably less than 24 special areas throughout the entire Earth in terms of the biodiversity that's here. So protecting it is really important. So the end of the story is we put together a rough draft of the Biodiversity Action Plan. The foundation partnered with the Laguna de Santa Rosa Foundation, who got some money from the Sonoma County Water Agency, to hold a 2-day conference about biodiversity in Sonoma County. And it was attended by most of the environmental orgs in the county. They went through the rough draft plan bit by bit, volunteered to come out and edit the whole thing, revise it, which was done. And about a month after that process concluded, a group of several dozen environmental organizations that had come together to form a climate adaptation plan for Sonoma County adopted the Biodiversity Action Plan as its basic reference science document. So that's an example of the kind of way the Community Foundation likes to convene, likes to build a process over time, and in this particular case was able to come out with a concrete, significant result.
I feel like I have a panel of matchmakers, because that's what it feels like, doesn't it? So I promise we're going to get into the audience, because I have a lot of questions, but I want to hear your questions first. And so we have an exercise for you that we want you to do by tables, but first I want to identify who we have in the room by having you raise your hands. So I'm kind of curious as to who's here from nonprofits and the management and staff. So raise your hand. And how many of you are from the boards serving those nonprofits? How many of you are from the grant maker funders community? And how many of you serve the boards of those groups? How many of you are philanthropists, social investors? And Impact 100. There you go. So what you will realize is that we have quite a diversity, I've noticed, at each of your tables. So we put index cards at the tables, and we really want to take 3 minutes. And I'm going to have Patty count down the 3 minutes. But we want you as a group to come up with 2 questions. Put 1 question on 1 index card, the second question on another index card. We're going to pick those questions up at the end of 3 minutes, but we want you to get to know each other as you're coming up with the questions, and we're going to seed the panelists with your questions. Start talking.
Yeah, lots of questions. It's supposed to come up with 2 questions. 1 question on each card. The entire table is going to decide on what the question will be. Someone with good handwriting is going to write it down. For the panel. Does anybody have any questions? and the two merge, and they just have either but I understand this is maybe the question more about resistance in existing organizations.
We have 1 minute to go.
Sorry, bathroom real quick? Nope, okay.
Well, that's all part of the assessment.
Piece of cake? No?
30 seconds to go.
Do we have any more questions? Do we have any great examples?
15 seconds.
So you want to find out who's staying. Okay. Question? Yeah. There'll be a lot of odd men now. We're kind of merging right now. We're part of the Parks Alliance.
Time's up.
So Anne is going to come along stage left, Constance stage right. You'll surrender your questions. And this is not going to, if we can reconvene here. So this won't be the only questions of the day.
We're still writing here.
What it will do is start to get us all thinking about the issues that this panel really needs to address. Okay? So if I can have your attention, please. If I can have your attention to the front. Thank you. I know. I love it. We got your collaboration juices going, I can tell. So I wanted to see the question with Bob, because we've talked a lot about shared projects as really sort of the low-hanging fruit and the most common type of joint partnership. And I want Bob to tell us, because you've probably seen a lot of attempts to do it, probably good and bad. I want you to talk to us about what are the greatest challenges for sort of these shared projects. And of course, for someone with a database background, as I do, from the reporting angle, how do you measure the outcomes, and how do you make sure that the stakeholders are getting what they need, and who gets to claim the credit for reporting back? So if you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, regarding the first question, as far as the challenges, and I think these apply not just to joint projects or joint programs, but apply to the whole range of options. There's a number that typically are potential roadblocks or areas that organizations have to work through. One is clearly identity, in terms of how are you going to share the identification of the organizations involved in the project, what are you going to call it, who's going to have their name on it, and in any form of partnership, dealing with issues of identity. And one of the things in terms of, even in a full integration of organizations, through those areas on the far right of the matrix, there are many, many options of dealing with identity, of sharing identity. Many organizations, even in a merger, utilize the identity just as they had before. So there's a lot of options of sharing identity and utilizing and being creative around identity issues. The other is autonomy and decision making, and this is in joint programming or joint project. How is decision making going to be accomplished? What is the process? Who's ultimately going to make a decision around either the formation of the project, whether it's going to be organizational leaders or whether the board's going to be involved in it, and ongoing, joint programming effort of the project. What is the decision-making process, and who's ultimately going to make decisions in terms of the operations, the day-to-day functioning of the organization in the particular program or project? The other is issues of self-interest. And giving up self-interest for the good of that project. Everybody has self-interest. It's normal, it's natural. We have self-interest in our roles, our responsibilities, our titles, our paycheck. Everything in terms of that relationship with the organization, there's some elements of self-interest. That has to be transparent and talked about and dealt with, because it is a normal, natural process, and there's some organizations or individuals have a tendency not to deal with that. We really encourage organizations to talk about that in terms of what is apparent to everyone in terms of self-interest and dealing with self-interest as far as being as open as possible. The other is the development of trust across organizations, among individuals at the table. Trust is critical, and any form of relationship that you're involved in, you really need to look at this as a trust-building exercise of accomplishing that trust that is required in order to work together on an ongoing basis and have that level of trust required for these partnerships. So trust is a critical one. And then the last one, and one of the area that probably can be the biggest stumbling block or biggest challenge to any of these forms of partnerships, and including joint programming, joint projects, is organizational culture. It's amazing to me when I go in and work with organizations, and I work with nonprofits across the spectrum of types of nonprofits. I've worked with organizations with budgets of 70,000, and I've worked with organizations with budgets of 110 million, and everything in between. It is always amazing to me how organizations that may look identical from the outside may be very, very different from the perspective of organizational culture. In decision-making, in communications, in formality of expectations within the organization, in expectations of how the hierarchy works within an organization, whether it's a consensus-driven organization or more of a hierarchical organization. And attending to culture is critical in this process. And then on the last part, as far as the credit for outcomes, who should take credit? It should be shared. You're doing this together. Whether it is a joint project or a more integrated form of partnership, you are both contributing, both organizations or multiple organizations in a joint project are contributing to that. So the greater that you can go to sharing the outcomes, both for good or negative, in terms of in terms of having it as a shared outcome for the project that you're sharing.
Thank you. So, Katrina, as you can imagine, there were very specific questions on your merger. So let me start with the one that all of us are wondering about, and that is, who left the organization in terms of staff? And what is the staff's sort of shakedown as a result of the merger?
Great question. So we were in a position where the executive director at Family Service Agency was a part-time executive director position. They could only afford, they'd been actually dwindling. They'd already gone down from 4 days a week to half-time. And she was truly a clinician. That's her passion, is in the delivery of mental health services. It wasn't in administration. And so we ended up, remained in the role of executive director. She is now the clinical director for the merged organization. There's a program director in the counseling department as well. We ended up at the end of all of it with one casualty, which was their existing clinical director. So she essentially took a step down in the organization, and she's in heaven. So, I mean, she loves it. She every time she walks by my office, she's like, I'm glad I'm not sitting there. We ended up in a position that was unusual. There were not two full-time executive directors with jobs on the line, and she was thrilled with the change.
Excellent. A true marriage. A little give and take.
Yeah.
And the second question is, what is the percentage of annual client increase after the merger? And what kind of evaluation are you doing to determine the success metric?
So we just completed the merge August 1st. We became a legally merged organization. So I am hesitant to put too much of the success story out there of what's going to happen afterward. What I can tell you is, because we merged, we were able to be awarded now 2 contracts, and we have 2 more pending, that neither one of the organizations by ourselves would have been awarded. Because of that, we've increased client services. This year we'll see an additional 100 children in counseling services, and at least an additional 60 or 70 seniors for depression and suicide prevention. So those are the numbers I know so far, and while we haven't gotten to the actual outcome yet, I anticipate that additional opportunities will come because of being a combined entity.
So I had the benefit of overhearing a conversation when you first came into the room, and that was the first 2 months, a little bit of dancing around each other. And I don't want to overstate this, but you said you're now into, I guess, more of the sort of settling in stage. You want to talk about kind of the stages of where you've been through and define them so that anybody going through it can know what to expect?
So I had successfully avoided using this analogy so far in this conversation, but I'm going to go to one that I've used with a few of my existing partners in the room, which is, it felt like we were on a first date, and then dating, and then engaged, and then married, and all of a sudden, I'm like, well, darn it, now we have 2 households to put together, and I don't like your furniture, and you don't like my curtains, and that negotiation, I mean, I hate to make it such a simplistic analogy, but it's a relationship analogy. We're in relationship with each other now. And the first 2 months, I was just really concerned, because I had staff who sat there, and it did not matter how much they talked or discussed something, they would not pick a new set of curtains. Like, they could not agree on what. And I had to come in and I had to do the boss thing, and I didn't want to do the boss thing. I wanted everybody to just, peacefully get along. They're now starting to do that. And that's it really just took in my lessons learned that I took some notes on. One of the things I would have had more time to do is work with the staff in advance of actually announcing it, and really get the staff comfortable, get more buy-in, let them pick the curtains in advance. Sorry to continue that analogy, but it really works, because in counseling offices there are curtains, and there's literally curtains when we disputed, which amazes me. But it's also the fiscal fallout. There's the costs we didn't quite anticipate, or that came in higher or lower. There's that one person who's a full-time admin support. Are we going to keep her? We're not going to keep her. What's her real value? What is she really doing? And it's difficult to come in and from the outside determine the value that somebody has in an organization until you've spent a lot of time. So it's those things that are starting to bubble up that are they're interesting, but they're bubbling and then settling much more naturally. So we're about 4 months in, and it's significantly more comfortable than the first couple of months, for sure.
So before I move on to Robert, one last question. Did you lose any donors in the merger? Was there a net?
We've gained donors. In the last 2 weeks, actually, I've had people reach out to me that have never sent me a request, a request for me to submit a letter to them. Surprisingly, to me, I was anticipating at least, kind of a flat line of the same people that funded us in the past. We would, anticipate their ongoing support. We have new people showing up at our door.
Well, there you go. That doesn't probably surprise you, Bob, does it?
Organizations have kind of mixed. There is a potential for organizations to reach new donors as a result of the consolidation and as a result of presenting expanded mission opportunities. So there really is, among many situations, opportunities to enhance your donor.
I read an analogy from a social media guy who was talking about this, and he said, you can't be afraid of co-opetition because what it allows you to do is to expand the pie. And expanding the pie means that everybody can have a bigger piece of it. So I think, I think you have to sort of keep your eye on that, but expanding the opportunity. But Robert, I wanted to ask, put one of these questions to you, and that is, and feel free, the rest of you, to weigh in. How do you find out about collaborative grants? And any ideas on how do you find a partner to collaborate with?
It's a good question. I'm not sure how to find out about collaborative grants. I'm not sure that there is actually a lot of grant making going on specifically with that in mind. More often when a funder puts a grant program together, they do so with a fairly clear set of specific outcomes that they want to see happen. They want to see an increase of something, they want to see something developed. They have a particular goal that they want to achieve. And if there are a couple of organizations that have a good working relationship to begin with, where one organization can bring a certain level of skill and experience and combine it with another organization, so that in the example that Katrina gave, the two organizations together are more capable than the two organizations separately. That would, to me, make a fairly strong case on a couple of levels for seriously considering that proposal. The organizations clearly have thought through the issue involved, the skills, the experience, the capacity they bring to that issue, and they found a way to work together to be more successful. As I said, I would certainly want to take a closer look at a proposal like that.
Bob, any recommendations?
Well, our experience is that many funders actually are pretty supportive of this activity right now, especially. And there are a number of cases around the country and several in the Bay Area where funders are creating the grant opportunities for supporting the exploration around partnerships. The San Francisco Foundation has a fund that's very significant to supporting nonprofits that are looking at either assessing or negotiating a potential partnership. There's a consortium in the South Bay of the combination of Applied Materials, Packard, and the United Way of Silicon Valley that have pooled the fund between those three funders that's specifically for this activity. And there's a number of them. Funders are also around the country are creating initiatives in which they provide a lot of education for nonprofits, for other funders around the exploration, giving out the information. Some of the purpose of providing this information is these are tools for all of you to be able to take and at the right time and with the right partner to take this information and utilize it. It's not for all organizations, and it depends upon your particular environment. The environment is changing rapidly. Over the next several years, we're going to be in a very, very tight situation economically and for government services and government-funded services. So these are opportunities for organizations to explore, but many funders are supporting this activity for fun.
Well, and I think you mentioned earlier today that a lot of this was explored in the healthcare reform initiatives, and I know I've worked with both 501c4s in healthcare and in environment now, and that's a huge focus and a paradigm shift, I would suggest. And the collaboration is getting a lot of credit in healthcare reform for being able to move that along quickly and to a successful end.
We're seeing a lot of that right now in terms of the organizations looking at untraditional partners to have greater impact along the continuum of health, mental health, social services, homelessness, domestic violence. All of these kinds of organizations are looking at how to potentially partner between and among, and it's not necessarily merging or integrative, but it's joint programming efforts or shared services. I'm working with an organization right now that is a mental health provider that is going to be co-locating with a primary care clinic so that they can provide both mental health and primary health care in the same site, so that they can combine their services. They aren't merging, they aren't combining their organizations, but they're co-locating to be able to join those services together.
Robert?
One of the things going on, particularly in Sonoma County, that I assume many of you are aware of, is there is a lot of conversation, particularly within the Health Action Program, about collective impact. There was an article written in the Stanford Social Innovation Review probably a little over a year ago that has just caught fire. And so what the County of Sonoma is doing in its convening through Health Action, which is the County Health Department and many of the not-for-profit health and human service-related organizations in the county who have developed a joint plan for their goal is to make Sonoma the healthiest county in the state of California by 2020. So they've done lots of research in this kind of collective impact work being done in other parts of the country, and they really have a very interesting model that they've developed for it. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept of collective impact, it differs from the concept of, like the convening we were doing around family homelessness. It's more than just a couple of homeless service organizations getting together on something that's common. It's getting physical health, mental health, employment services, drug abuse services, and a variety of other. It's more cross-section and more multidisciplinary. Particularly if you think for 2 seconds about any fundamental human service problem, it's never one thing. It's a combination of things. And so if you start thinking about how do you make a whole person more healthy, what services, what parts of the community do you bring in? And if you can bring them in together to create a common set of outcomes that everybody works on, over the course of time, the impact that you can have cumulatively is, at least in theory, substantially greater than what you can do by yourself.
I guess I have to be the first person to put the word sustainability onto the docket, but what we're really talking about is the sort of sustainability and health of the initiatives, and whatever it takes to serve the community, that's what we need to explore, and that's really the paradigm shift that's going on, is what I'm hearing. So Katrina, back to you. As you can imagine, we got questions about culture, and I have to reference at the beginning of today's seminar, you mentioned that about 18 years ago you were forced into one of these situations, and I think that was the verb you used. And I'm wondering if 18 years ago, the forcing of the situation and what you saw when you went through your round robin, if there was a cultural kind of zeitgeist that you were either looking for that exists now more easily versus 18 years ago. But talk to us a little bit about that sort of matching process and, you know, and what it takes to sort of get at that.
So not having been in Sonoma County 18 years ago when that was happening, I don't know if I'm clear, having asked a lot about the history, but not having experienced it, about what the culture of collaboration was at the time, but I got the impression from a few of the historians in the room, as I've asked these questions to different executive directors, that there wasn't that same culture of collaboration present 18 years ago. Perhaps because people were geographically dispersed and had their territories, and we weren't quite, you know, we hadn't quite all expanded into each other as much as each area of Sonoma County has now. I think what happened by being forced into collaboration was that everybody realized we can do it, and we can do it well, and oh, well, we're done with that fight. We never have to have that fight again. We've got that one handled. You know, who's going to take the lead when this type of circumstance comes up, and how do we actually have equal votes at the table when there's 4 of us, and then who's the tiebreaker, and they seem like silly little things, but they actually are really important when you work together to deliver services and there's money on the table. You have to go through those processes. And so because of whatever the county's culture, organizational cultures, executive directors, personalities over the years that have come out and fallen out in the end, my experience in Sonoma County is actually different than any place I've worked, which is that we are more willing to collaborate than anything I've seen before. And I have better, stronger, truly collaborative. We may never ever say the M word, the merge word to each other, but we want to work together. If there's a grant opportunity, I'm gonna pick up the phone and call so-and-so and say, hey, this looks like a great opportunity. I think we can do it better together than